mental health is beyond the um, elimination or reduction of these symptoms. It's something more. And this framework for understanding flourishing or well-being with these four pillars is one example of how we can think about qualities that go beyond simply reducing symptoms of depression or anxiety. Um, so virtually all modern forms of treatment are really forms of treatment that are not designed to cultivate mental health, but they're designed to reduce symptoms of mental illness or mental distress.
Today's guest is Dr. Richie Davidson. Dr. Davidson received his PhD in psychology from Harvard in 1976. His research is broadly focused on the neural basis of emotion and emotional style and methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and related contemplative practices. He has published over 600 papers, numerous chapters and reviews, and edited 20 books.
He was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2006 and was elected by the National Academy of Medicine in 2017 and appointed to the governing board of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development in 2018. In 2014, Davidson founded the nonprofit Healthy Minds Innovations, which translates scientific tools to cultivate and measure well-being. It's an honor to have you on with us today. I think our paths first crossed back in 2007 when I was presenting at a Mind and Life Summer Research Institute talking about the human amygdala and linking it to social network size and diversity. This is not the first study that looked at social connections. In fact, there have been many studies that looked at the positive benefits of social connections, everything from lower all-cause mortality to less susceptibility to the common cold, less cognitive decline with aging. And your work speaks specifically to this. But it didn't start there. It sounds like, if I'm correct, your work actually started on the darker side of emotion, on suffering from the pressures of adversity and emotional disruptions with depression and anxiety. But then after years of work in this area, you met somebody that inspired you to pivot into the field I think we know you best for today. So can you start by telling us that origin story?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having me. In the early part of my career, I was focused on what made people vulnerable to life's slings and arrows. And I was particularly concerned with brain mechanisms that were associated with vulnerability to depression and anxiety and stress-related disorders. And then in 1992, I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama asked me very innocently, why can't you use the same tools of modern neuroscience that you're using to study anxiety and depression and fear, and use those tools to study kindness and to study compassion? And that was a wake-up call for me. I didn't have a very good answer for him other than that it's hard. But, when we first started to study anxiety and stress, that was hard too. And I think most scientists would agree that there's been some progress made in those areas. And that was really the beginning of a turning. And then about um, uh, 10 years later, we began to do research on meditation and positive qualities of the mind. And it eventually led to the creation of the Center for Healthy Minds, which I founded in 2009. The mission of our center is to cultivate well-being and relieve suffering through the scientific understanding of the mind. And the Dalai Lama came out to Madison to help inaugurate the center. And this is really what I've been dedicating my life to for the last 25 years.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think up until that point, science hadn't really looked into these positive mental states? Why have we just been solely focused on the negative mental states so much?
Well, I think it's really for a variety of reasons. Psychology and its neighboring disciplines have been historically focused on treating people with um, mental disorders. And when I was a student, I was trained to look at a person and to try to figure out what's wrong with them. And now I look at a person and try to figure out what's right with them. And it's a completely different orientation. But so much of the apparatus of psychology and psychiatry is really focused on pathology. And to the extent that mental health is considered, mental health is usually viewed as the absence of mental illness, which is, in my view, a, a deeply impoverished view of mental health.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Pathologizing our environment and our surroundings. We see it here in science, but certainly you could extrapolate that out to a lot of other things that, people are dealing with and people are doing now.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's
So you've also, a big kind of fundamental term that you've used plenty of times is well-being. And I think defining exactly what well-being is important. Could you please do that for us?
maybe. It's we use well-being really as a kind of heuristic placeholder. Another term which is often used analogously is flourishing. And what we mean by these terms is a kind of activation of all of the innate capacities that humans are born with that enable us to be our best self. And we have specifically delineated four key elements that are crucial to well-being or to flourishing. One of them we call awareness. The second we call connection. The third we call insight. And a fourth is purpose. And I can go through each in turn a little bit. Awareness is our capacity to be self-aware and also our capacity for meta-awareness. Um, and this is a term that psychologists and neuroscientists have used to describe the capacity that humans have to know that they're knowing, to really know what their mind is doing. And that may sound strange to listeners, but how many of you have had the experience of reading a book where you might be reading each word on a page and you might be reading one page, a second page, and going on for a few minutes. And after a while, you have no friggin' idea what you've just read. Your mind is just somewhere else. But we recognize that. The moment we recognize that is a moment of meta awareness. And it turns out that meta awareness is something that can be trained. And we believe it's a key substrate for all other forms of transformation. So that's awareness. The second pillar is connection, and connection is about qualities that are important for healthy social relationships. Qualities like appreciation and gratitude and kindness and compassion. The third pillar we call insight, and insight is about a experiential understanding of how our thoughts and our expectations, our beliefs about ourselves shape our experience of the world, literally define our reality. And so we know that there are people on one end of a continuum who have very negative beliefs about themselves, who have very low expectations of themselves. And of course, that's a prescription for depression. But what's really crucial for flourishing is not so much changing this narrative, but it's changing our relationship to the narrative so that we can see the narrative for what it is, which is really a constellation of thoughts. And finally, the last pillar is purpose. And purpose is not about finding something more purposeful to do with your life, some lofty kind of activity, but how can we find meaning and purpose in even the most pedestrian activities of daily living? Can taking out the garbage be a deeply meaningful, purposeful experience? And of course it could be. It just requires a little bit of reframing. And all of these are trainable skills, and they all comprise what it means to flourish.
One question that I've seen you talk about um, in reference to Tom Insel's um, comments and reflection on his career and the fact that years at NIMH and the work on mental health maybe didn't move the needle as much as he had expected. Is how does modern medicine, modern psychology and therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, these different forms of therapy differ from kind of cultivating well-being using these pillars?
Yeah, so there are a whole lot of questions that are sort of wrapped up in that. Most psychological treatments, or for that matter, pharmacological treatments for depression or anxiety, various forms of distress, are primarily aimed at reducing the symptoms that these disorders have, that are associated with these disorders. And we consider a treatment successful if the symptoms go down. But of course, that's not what mental health is. Mental health is beyond the um, elimination or reduction of these symptoms. It's something more. And this framework for understanding flourishing or well-being with these four pillars is one example of how we can think about qualities that go beyond simply reducing symptoms of depression or anxiety. Um, so virtually all modern forms of treatment are really forms of treatment that are not designed to cultivate mental health, but they're designed to reduce symptoms of mental illness or mental distress.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like, especially this third pillar, the insight pillar that you mentioned, where understanding that we all have narratives, that we all have thoughts, and I think you've described our thoughts as being clouds in the sky, where you just see them passing by, you notice them, but you also know that they're just passing by, or being a witness to your thoughts rather than being influenced by them.
Or
Um,
hijacked by them.
yes, correct me if I'm wrong in anything I say, please. But I do wonder, um, this kind of thought process might sit in contrast to some common forms of therapies today, such as maybe even cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure therapy. But either way, we see that there's improvements in PTSD with exposure therapy and anxiety and depression with cognitive behavioral therapy. I believe you've mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy as a good therapy, but it seems to me that it sits in contrast to this kind of thought process. Can you please expand on it and maybe enlighten me a little bit regarding that connection?
Yeah, so this framework is not meant to replace existing therapeutic modalities. There are certainly roles for exposure therapy or cognitive behavior therapy, or for that matter, medication,
Mm,
um, depending on exactly what situation a person finds her or himself in. These different therapeutic modalities may be appropriate and may be what's called for in that moment. But they are not strategies to promote well-being. They're strategies to reduce symptoms of depression or anxiety.
mm,
And it may be that in a particular situation, that really is the thing that would be most skillful to do at the present point in time. And then perhaps once the symptoms are reduced to some extent, then a person can really work on cultivating flourishing or well-being. So it's not meant to replace them, although we have recently conducted a very large randomized controlled trial with depressed patients, with a sample size of greater than 1,000, using our Healthy Minds framework and program to cultivate well-being. And we found that focusing on strengths actually is no less effective than a standard psychological treatment designed to reduce the symptoms. And it may also, and well, two things. One is that it also improves well-being, and not all treatments for depression, for example, reduce well-being. They may decrease depressive symptoms, but that doesn't necessarily mean they increase well-being. We found that well-being was increased. In addition, these strategies, because they involve cultivating skills that are considered to be lifelong skills, they may actually lead to more enduring positive benefit than traditional treatments, although the jury is out on that because the right studies haven't yet been done.
One thing real quick. You've mentioned well-being several times, and we kind of talked about it before, but can you just convince us, A, is well-being equivalent to happiness? And if so, or if not, why is well-being so important from maybe a longevity standpoint or from some other metric?
Yeah, first of all, well-being is not the same as happiness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a person can have very high levels of well-being and cry with sadness at a funeral. They're not happy.
Mm.
In fact, if you were happy when a loved one died, I would say that that's pretty maladaptive.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea that one should be happy all the time is deeply misguided, in my view,
Mm-hmm.
and really is just not focusing on the right issues. So it's just not about happiness. So you can have very high levels of well-being and still be sad. Um, and well-being is really about these four pillars: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. We know that people with higher levels of well-being live longer, for example. There's a wealth of evidence to suggest that. We know that countries in whom the majority of the population reports higher levels of well-being, the longevity, the life expectancy in those countries is greater. And these are not small, statistical differences. These are whopping differences. So if you look at the data, the differences between countries where the majority of people report very high levels of well-being compared to those that do not, the life expectancy differences are greater than 30 years.
Wow.
So these are enormous
It's
differences.
incredible.
So, if I could summarize, one of the things that you're bringing up is that refocusing efforts from diminishing symptoms related to a mental health disorder to boosting well-being, boosting kind of the pillars that lead to flourishing, is the key. And maybe you can just make it tangible for us and talk about meditation as one mechanism to do that.
Yeah, so meditation is certainly one important strategy that we have in our armamentarium of strategies to specifically cultivate each of these four pillars: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And our affiliated nonprofit organization, Healthy Minds Innovations, has put out an app called the Healthy Minds Program, which contains meditation instructions in each of these four pillars. The app is totally free, and it's the only app of its kind that actually is evidence-based. There are 2 published randomized controlled trials using it and several more in the works. The New York Times Wirecutter named it as one of the 3 best meditation apps for 4 years in a row. And so for listeners that are interested, this is certainly a place you can start. And one of the cool things we do in the app is that you don't have to do any formal meditation, because you can actually meditate anywhere, anytime. So you can do these practices actively while you're walking, while you're commuting, while you're doing your laundry, while you're exercising. It doesn't matter as long as you are intentionally using your mind. And we have specific practices that are active practices in the app. And the data show that people who use the active practices do just as well as the people who do the practices as formal meditation practices. There's absolutely no difference in the efficacy.
Well, that lowers the barrier to entry because I know many patients whom I see after brain injury or with mild cognitive impairment, trying to make their brain better, trying to decrease stress and things like that. Say, no, you know what, doc, meditation's not for me. I can't do it. What do can you walk us through kind of an active meditation? What does that actually look like?
Well, so, if you're washing the dishes, you can do one of several things. First, you can be aware of what you're doing. You can actually use awareness practice to feel the water on your hands, to notice the feel of what you're picking up to do the washing. You can also use it as an appreciation practice. You can use it to reflect on uh, the the food that you've been blessed to have available for you to eat. If you're washing the dishes and you're part of a family or you live with other people, presumably that's an act that's helpful to others, not just to yourself. So you can consider it an act of generosity, and you can reflect on that. So, there's so many possibilities, and that's just one simple example. And you can take virtually any of the interstitial kinds of spaces in our daily routine and turn them into a practice. And then really any activity that's not cognitively demanding, you can turn it into a practice. One of the things I often remind people is that when we first evolved as humans on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And I think most people would agree that most people on the planet brush their teeth and spend a few minutes a day doing that. And that's not in our genome. It's something we've learned to do. And we've learned to do it because we think it's important for our personal physical hygiene. And yet, I think most people would agree that our minds are probably even more important than our teeth. And yet, most people don't even treat their minds with the same respect as they treat their teeth. The data show that if we spent even as short a time every day as we spend brushing our teeth, nourishing our mind, this world would be a different place.
Mm. I'd like to circle back on one thing, if I may. You mentioned purpose before. And I've heard you stress the importance of purpose, particularly in those above the age of 65. So I'd appreciate it if you could give us that stat again regarding how purpose relates to longevity in those above the age of 65. But then also, I think that especially in our younger generation, there's seemingly a lack of purpose. Um, are you able to maybe extrapolate that out to all age groups, and then maybe how someone can find purpose? And I find it interesting how you mentioned, it doesn't have to be this grand purpose that you're finding, right? It can be in some menial things potentially.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's a lot to say there. On the first point, it turns out that having a strong sense of purpose is the single most important psychological predictor of longevity for people 65 and older. Uh, and if you look at the data, there's now a whole cottage industry of studies that support this, following people longitudinally in their later years of life, and having a strong sense of purpose is unequivocally strongly predictive of longevity. And so that's telling. And then your other comment is so important, that purpose is not just important for people who are old, it's important for all of us at any age. And just to give one example, we did some research during COVID with public school teachers, whose average age was around in their late 30s, early 40s. And one of the things that we did is invite them to reflect on their sense of purpose before they began school each day. And it turned out that uh, simply reminding them to reflect on their sense of purpose, for many of these teachers, they described it as an elixir for their soul. It really reconnected them to why they became teachers in the first place and gave them a sense of vitality that really helped them navigate the challenges that they were confronting. And so having a sense of purpose is not just for older folks, but it's for all of us. And we can, as you were reminding listeners, we can connect our sense of purpose to even the most seemingly pedestrian activities of our daily living. We have a cat at home, and I'm the one who scoops the cat litter every night, and I turn it into a little purpose practice. I love doing it. I look forward to it. I used to really not like doing it. And It's amazing how just reflecting on, wow, I know our cat is going to really appreciate this. My wife is going to appreciate this. People who walk into the room are going to be appreciative that the litter is scooped on a daily basis. And just reflecting, it's an act of generosity and reflecting on that. And just a simple mindset shift is all it takes to completely transform that task, which many would consider, a menial task that's mildly aversive. It's something that you really look forward to doing every day.
We've got maybe just enough time for what we call the 3-2-1 closer, where we ask you to come up with 3 truths about well-being, 2 fictions, and 1 thing anyone can do today to boost well-being.
3 truths. One is that the most important truth is that well-being is a skill, that it's changeable. The second truth is that it's a lot easier than you think. And the third truth is that if you practice at it daily, you'll notice a change within 1 month.
Mm.
So you said 2 myths.
Yeah.
One is that
well-being.
2 fictions. One is that well-being and happiness are the same. That's a complete myth. And the second is that well-being is kind of a fixed characteristic. People differ in their level of well-being, but if I'm someone who doesn't have high levels of well-being, I'm sort of doomed to be grumpy for the rest of my life. That's a myth. The one thing you can do every day is to express appreciation and gratitude at every moment that is appropriate for that expression. And I guarantee your well-being will improve.
Incredible. I think that's a great way to end it. Dr. Davidson, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. We wish we could speak longer, but hopefully that'll happen at a later date. We learned so much just in 30 minutes, and we really appreciate you. We appreciate you educating us and all the work that you've done in potentially moving the needle for mental health. We really, really do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me, and sorry it's a little short, but I'm happy we were able to do it.
That's okay. Thank you so much, everybody. The mighty, the mindful, Dr. Richie Davidson.
Thank you very much.